Hey guys, tonight we're going to settle in with something that feels like the bedtime story equivalent of lukewarm tea. Nothing too exciting, nothing too dramatic, just the long, slow unraveling of royal families who lost their thrones, and, more specifically, what happened to their children after the crown slipped away. Did they end up quietly knitting in some drafty corner of a monastery? Were they married off to someone equally miserable? Or, in some cases, did they find themselves staring at a dungeon wall while contemplating how unfair life is when your parents make political enemies? So, get cozy. Dim the lights. Let's float back a few centuries and watch as history once again reminds us that being born royal was less about fairy tales and more about whether you'd survive the fallout of your parents' bad decisions. Let's start with one of the most obvious crash and burn examples. Edward II of England. Edward, who reigned from 1307 to 1327, is remembered as one of those kings who just couldn't get it together. He liked boats. He liked digging ditches. He liked hanging out with his friends more than running a country. None of this was exactly ideal when your actual job was keep England stable. Naturally, he annoyed the nobles, annoyed his wife Isabella of France, and eventually lost the throne altogether. Now, Edward had children. His son, Edward III, was technically one of the children of a deposed king, which sounds like it should be a tragic setup for a sad little life. Except in this case, the kid did pretty well. He was used by Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer to justify overthrowing Edward II, and then crowned king at just 14 years old. So, what happens when you're the child of a deposed king? Sometimes you simply become the next king, because apparently medieval politics had all the consistency of a soap opera. Edward III went on to have a long reign, start the 100 Years' War, and father way too many children. But his siblings? Slightly less glamorous fates. His daughter Joan died of the plague before she could even get married. His younger sons got titles, but they also ended up in the endless web of Plantagenet family feud. Which just goes to show, being the kid of a fallen monarch didn't always mean dungeon walls. Sometimes it meant inheriting the family drama like a hand-me-down sweater you never asked for. Now let's drift over to Scotland, where political stability was more of a recurring dream than a reality. Consider Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's only son, James VI, had a very unusual childhood. Son of a queen who was forced to abdicate, raised away from her entirely, and eventually, oh look, now I'm king of both Scotland and England. Mary was imprisoned, shuffled around, and eventually executed by her cousin Elizabeth I. But her son James? He was taken away as a baby, raised by Scottish nobles who wanted nothing to do with his mother's disastrous reign, and essentially molded into their version of a politically useful king. The result? James grew up slightly paranoid, very obsessed with witch hunts, and forever convinced that assassination plots were around every corner. Which, fair enough, because half of Europe probably did want him dead. Still, James shows us that kids of deposed monarchs didn't always fade into obscurity. Sometimes they hit the royal jackpot. He got not one, but 2 kingdoms and even a fancy new title. James I of England. So, yes, child of a deposed queen, but also, weirdly, the most successful inheritance package in this lineup. But if you're looking for less happy outcomes, the French royal family never fails to deliver. Take the children of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Their story is basically the opposite of cozy. During the French Revolution, Louis and Marie found themselves in the kind of trouble that no amount of cake jokes could fix. Their children were swept up in it, too. The eldest son, Louis Joseph, died of tuberculosis before the revolution really got going. Which, honestly, may have been the least traumatic outcome. The younger son, Louis Charles, was proclaimed Louis XVII by royalists after his parents were executed. Except he never actually got to rule. Instead, he was locked up in a cell at the Temple prison, neglected, abused, and eventually died at the age of 10. That's one way to redefine childhood trauma. Their daughter, Marie-Therese, fared slightly better. She survived imprisonment and was eventually released. But imagine being the only surviving child of Marie Antoinette and having to carry that family name around Europe. She became known as Madame Royale, married a cousin, and lived a long life, though apparently she was perpetually grumpy, which feels understandable given her entire childhood resume was just tragedy after tragedy. So in France, being the child of a deposed monarch often meant misery, prison, or becoming the awkward survivor at family reunions where everyone else is already dead. Let's meander over to Russia, because if anyone perfected the art of making life terrible for royal children, it was the Romanovs. A classic example. The kids of Nicholas II and Alexandra. Now, technically, Nicholas wasn't just deposed. He and his whole family were executed in 1918. But before that grim ending, his 5 children lived the strange half-life of deposed royalty. They were moved from palace to palace under house arrest, forced into increasingly cramped conditions, and watched as their world shrank from imperial splendor to bare walls and suspicious guards. The 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, were sometimes treated with politeness, sometimes mocked, depending on which guards were on shift. Their brother, Alexei, who had hemophilia, suffered constant health crises without proper care. And while rumors spread for decades about Anastasia possibly escaping, the truth is that none of them survived. The Romanovs are a reminder that being the child of a fallen monarch in the modern era didn't just mean obscurity. It meant your entire existence could become a political liability, and those don't usually live long. For something slightly less horrifying, let's float back to Spain. Consider the children of Joanna of Castile. Better known as Joanna the Mad. Joanna was technically queen, but also technically locked away for decades while her father, then her husband, then her son, all ruled in her name. Her children had very different fates. One of them, Charles V, ended up becoming Holy Roman Emperor, which sounds impressive, but came with the standard Habsburg genetic issues and stress levels. Others married into different courts across Europe, because that was the default safety plan. If your mom was sidelined as mad and your dad conveniently died young, you still had dynastic value. Marriages were the escape hatch. So in Spain's case, the children of a deposed, or at least sidelined, queen became political bargaining chips. You didn't necessarily rot in prison, you were just traded around like particularly valuable chess pieces. And then there's the Ottoman Empire, which had its own unique spin on this problem. Ottoman princes, called Saitsads, had a rough time. If your father the Sultan was deposed or died, you didn't get a cozy retirement. Instead, you were either kept in the palace under strict confinement, or, more bluntly, executed by your brother when he became Sultan. The Ottomans had a tradition called fratricide. Basically, congratulations, you're the new Sultan. Now please strangle your brothers with silk cords so they don't cause trouble. It was sold as a way to prevent civil war, but if you were one of the unlucky children of a deposed sultan, your odds of making it to adulthood were slim. Eventually, the Ottomans softened this policy into the kaffe system, where royal brothers were locked in a sort of luxurious cage within the palace. You got food, servants, and comfort, but absolutely no freedom. Some princes spent decades in the caves, slowly going mad from boredom, which honestly might be worse than the silk cord.